So thank you for having me here to speak today. I'm Cathy from AOC. So I'm talking today about a site located at Loak Farm. It's located just north of Perth, south of Bankfoot, directly to the west of the A9. The work came about due to a planning requirement which required a watch and brief exercise on all groundbreaking in advance of sand and gravel extraction for Breedon, who were supplying some of the aggregate for the A9 dualling for this section just to the north of Perth. CFA Archaeology undertook monitoring and then the subsequent excavation on the archaeological features across the Phase 1 area, marked here on the north of the map, and then AOC undertook the work in the Phase 2 area to the west and the south, which is what I'll be talking about today. So the development lies in an area where there's been a substantial amount of prehistoric archaeology already recorded, including the schedule monument of the Loak Standing Stone, as well as the Court Hill Barrow. There's also many sites identified as crop marks from aerial photographs, which you can see marked here mostly in the yellow, which indicate the presence of multiple pit alignments and clusters of pits and post holes. In the wider area, known prehistoric sites include evidence for early prehistoric and Iron Age settlement at New Mills, and to the south of the site, the 18th century House of Nairn is recorded, and it may have had a 15th century medieval precursor. There's sort of references to that potential. So this is all pointing towards a well-used landscape. It's certainly rich in prehistoric activity, and there's some evidence of medieval activity as well. So subsequent to the A9 dualling and the section north of Perth, there's then a lot more detail in the historic environment record. The site at Loak in Phase 1 is probably familiar to many of you who would have attended Magnus Kirby's talk on the Phase 1 works in 2020. It's available online at the TAFAC YouTube channel for anyone who's interested in more detail. But in summary, they identified an extensive late prehistoric settlement with 7 roundhouses, various 4 and 6 post structures, and numerous groups of pits. Radiocarbon dating placed most of these features to the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, and there was one kiln dated to the early medieval period in the 5th, 6th century AD, indicating the landscape didn't go out of use at the end of the prehistoric period. Other recent work at New Mills Stanley Road was in advance of another borrow pit about a kilometre downstream in the Ordie Burn, and that identified late Neolithic pits containing grooved ware, as well as further evidence for late prehistoric settlement with early to middle Iron Age structures, and also a late 11th to 13th century AD clay-lined wattle kiln. More details on this site can be found in Yvonne Robertson's paper in last year's volume of the journal. So on to the results from the Phase 2 works at Loak Farm. The features identified comprised one group of pits in the northwest of the site, one in the south, both of those are circled, and various relatively isolated pits in the southern area, as well as 3 large structures. The excavation and subsequent post-excavation analysis identified 5 main phases of activity through a program of radiocarbon dating. So we have evidence for the Neolithic, the Bronze Age, the early Iron Age, the early medieval, and also the medieval phase. The bulk of the evidence relates to the medieval phase, but first I'll give a very brief overview of the earlier phases on site before focusing in on the medieval phase. The pits identified at Loak Farm, particularly in this northwest corner, represent occupation ranging from the Neolithic, Bronze Age and early Iron Age, and they're primarily located in pit group 1, where there's a bit more of a detailed map on the bottom right there. Many of these pits were used for the disposal of fuel debris, cooking and food waste, and most likely related to nearby settlement. So 2 pits on the site were dated to the Neolithic. They contained fire-cracked stones, roundwood hazel charcoal, and small fragments of burnt animal bone, which represented food waste being disposed into these pits. One of these Neolithic features was clearly recut with a later pit, and a date from the fill of that indicated it was likely infilled sometime in the Bronze Age with fuel and food waste, so showing a sort of a reuse of a landscape over time. Features in this pit group also represented an area of slightly more coherent archaeological survival, with a possible early Iron Age structure represented by this arc of post holes surrounding a large pit. Could have formed something like a windbreak, or potentially it was once more complete and formed a very truncated roundhouse. And this indicates later prehistoric settlement in more or less the same location as the earlier phases of activity from the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. And also the key thing here is that they're just peripheral to the much more extensive settlement identified in Phase 1, which dated primarily to the Bronze Age with some early Iron Age activity. We also had a single feature relating to early medieval activity. Cooking waste and a concentration of charred hazelnut shell in one pit indicated traces of activity in the 6th to 7th centuries AD. And although we only have this one feature, which was dated to this period, and you can see from this photo it's relatively unassuming in its nature, I think this means we can speculate that we have traces of settlement, trace evidence of settlement. The structures from this period are not likely to survive archaeologically due to the lack of earth-fast components. They're often built primarily out of turf. And so we see this on many other rural agricultural sites from this period, that this lowland early medieval settlement is very challenging to identify. Although we do increasingly have quite a few sites starting to emerge, dating to around the 7th century AD, and these are in particular being recognised by programmes of work through development-led projects where there's extensive radiocarbon dating programmes, such as at Loak Farm. So I'm going to focus in now on the medieval period, which is where the bulk of our evidence was placed. There were various isolated pits in the southern part of the site, one pictured here. This contained several fills, and hazel roundwood charcoal was dated from the lower fill, indicating the initial infilling occurred no earlier than the 13th century AD, so firmly into the medieval period. It also contained several sherds of discarded Scottish white gritty ware, likely dating to the 13th to 14th centuries AD, and later fills at the top of the pit indicated the later infilling probably occurred sometime between the 14th and 15th centuries. So this could indicate a large feature that's been open for some time and used intermittently for the deposition of food waste, including grain, fragments of animal bone, and several fragments of Scottish medieval redware. An alternative interpretation is that it's being filled in with material coming from different locations. But the dating seems to imply that it's been left open in some areas for a period of time. Another large pit in the vicinity of this contained 88 fragments of Scottish redware jug, this dating broadly to the 14th to 15th centuries, as well as a grindstone, 8 fragments of at least 2 other jugs on a Scottish white grittyware fabric, and a few fragments from yet another jug in Scottish redware. So the contents of this pit would suggest it was used for the disposal of material around the 14th to 15th centuries, around the same time the other large pit was being filled in. The jug was of particular note because it must have been almost complete at the point it was discarded, implying it's probably coming from a settlement relatively nearby. And the upper part of the jug itself is quite distinctive. It was covered in a green bib glaze with contrasting brown decoration. This was applied in large horseshoe shapes, flanked by a series of vertical lines and pellets. This motif is a common feature of whiteware jugs manufactured in Yorkshire from the 13th century. And this can maybe indicate that the Loak Farm jug is a later Scottish-made copy in the style of the Yorkshire whiteware. Similar decoration has been observed on sherds from the Cinema House excavations at St Andrews, the medieval kiln site at East Coulston and East Lothian, and potentially a shoulder sherd from Kirk Close in Perth. But these vessels only partially survive and are all on an East Coast Scottish white grittyware fabric rather than the redware we see at Loak Farm. The best parallel for a Scottish redware fabric is a complete jug which was recovered from Loch Leven before 1831, now held in a private collection at Blair Adam. Thanks to Derek Hall for pointing out this example and for the use of his image as well. The fact that the Scottish-made ceramics appear to be copies of Yorkshire imported vessels implies they were highly popular. It's an interesting style, and it's therefore obviously worth the effort to mimic the design and decoration on a local fabric. ICP, or inductively coupled plasma analysis, was undertaken to provenance it. We don't have any known medieval pottery kilns that are confidently identified in this part of Perth and Kinross, and this confirmed that the fabric was similar to a vessel from Canal Street in Perth. So although they're not identical, this does imply a similarity in the clay source and provenance, and suggests a connection to an as of yet unidentified kiln in the region. So the grindstone, which was identified in the same pit as the medieval pottery, pictured on the right of this slide, indicates that blade maintenance and sharpening was taking place on site. These finds are mounted rotating sharpening tools for blades, chisels, and things like other metal cutting edges. This particular example is in a local sandstone with a central perforation where the wooden spindle would have been. Rotary grindstones we know are in use from the early medieval period. There's some examples from hill forts such as Denad and Clatchard Craig, but they've become much more common from the medieval period onwards. There's a nice example from Bonaccord in Aberdeenshire, and this is suggested to date from as early as the late 12th century to early 13th century. The form and fabric combined with the rural context at Loak Farm suggests it's probably been used primarily for sharpening tools related to everyday domestic and agricultural use. Evidence for metalworking taking place on the site was quite limited, but we did have some evidence present in the form of small industrial waste fragments of slag and hearth lining, and several small hearths were identified near to the medieval pits and dated to the medieval period themselves, the 13th, 14th century, which had hearth lining and fragments of hammer scale and slag spheres, which indicates we have in situ smithing activity taking place on this part of the site. So as well as these isolated pits and various clusters of features dating to the medieval period, we also had these 3 large stone line features which were identified nearby. 2 that are pictured here were recorded and then preserved in situ, while a third was excavated to characterize them. The feature on the left had a rounded stone line terminal and was overlain by a subrectangular deposit, likely forming the remains of the base of a building. During the cleaning of this feature for its recording, 2 body sherds of medieval redware pottery were derived from the upper fills, and that indicated a broad 12th to 15th century AD date. The one on the right you can see is a similar example. It's stone lined but has a curving feature at the base of the slope. And so based on the excavated example we have, we've interpreted these 2 as grain drying kilns. So the third stone line structure was the one we excavated to characterize the type. It was cut into the steeply sloping ground above the Ordey Burn and lined with large sub-rounded boulders, and a series of flat slabs at the terminal or the kiln bowl provided a surface. Multiple slots were excavated through it in various different locations to initially confirm the nature of the deposits in all parts of the structure prior to full excavation of the fill. It was confirmed to be a kiln feature rather than a souterrain, which is one of the early interpretations of the features, and this was in part due to the bowl-shaped nature of the terminal, which you can see on the left-hand image. The stones also widened towards the top of the flue rather than narrowing in, meaning corbelling would not have been possible. If you combine that with the substantial grain assemblage, hence the Grain of Truth title, that was identified during the post-excavation programme, and the multiple fragments of Scottish medieval redware pottery in the infill, this confirms the interpretation of these features as substantial grain drying kilns dating to the medieval period. These more detailed shots here illustrate the heat-affected and worn nature of the paving slabs on the left, and the image on the right demonstrates how the stone lining was built really tight to the original cut into the natural gravel where the lining has been removed. The basal kiln deposits included some lenses of charcoal-rich material which relates to fires and rake-out ashy material, indicating it's been used on multiple occasions. Radiocarbon dating from various deposits indicates the kiln was likely constructed no earlier than the 14th century AD, and then in use from the early 14th to the mid-15th century AD. After it went out of use, the infill deposits show that it's been deliberately infilled in places, and these are quite different in the kiln bowl compared to the contrast from the deposits in the flue where the fires were set, but both areas demonstrate multiple separate infilling events. The deposits on the bottom right show here the area outside the kiln flue, and they are largely related to rake and clear out events. So micromorphology was undertaken to better understand the infilling of the kiln, confirm if it was deliberately decommissioned and how it's degraded over time. 8 of the tins were selected for further analysis from a slot in the kiln bowl and a slot in the flue, allowing for a direct spatial comparison. Different formation processes were identified, including trampled floor surfaces and burning residues in the base of the flue, and this is in contrast to the deposits in the kiln bowl, which contain much less charred wood, but did include large quantities of burnt grain. A general absence of evidence for soil formation processes in these basal fills indicates that the structure must have been roofed, and this is because it's not been left open to the elements for sufficient time to allow for the mixing of sediments by soil invertebrates or the roots of soil flora. Similarly, the absence of clay coatings on the infills in the basal units of both the main chamber and the flue provide evidence that the structure must have been roofed and therefore protected from water ingress. So the basal deposits indicate at least 4 completely separate burning events surviving from the latest use of the kiln. Sharp boundaries in the thin sections in the flue indicate floor maintenance activities and the rakeout, which would have been required for repeated use of the structure over a period of time. So we can speculate we have 4 known fires, but there must be many more with the amount of rakeout material and evidence for that happening in the flue area. The in situ fires and the presence of large numbers of phytoliths and wood charcoal indicate a mixed fuel regime, which includes wood and grass fuel, and this would suggest a low temperature smoky fire. This fuel would imply that the fires are not only deliberately set, but appear to have been quite well controlled. They're designed to burn at a constant temperature, which is good for maintaining heat and drying out large quantities of grain and reducing the risk of charring or the whole kiln going up in smoke. Based on the inclusions, the initial infill deposit over these in situ layers, once the thing's out of use, have most likely been sourced from within or very close to a settlement, so in giving us the sense the settlement that's using these kilns is nearby. The upper deposits in both the flue and the kiln bowl are very unsorted, and that's characteristic of multiple rapid backfill events taking place after they're completely out of use. The macroplant and charcoal assemblage from the medieval deposits was large and well preserved. Oats were dominant, and this is opposed to the hulled barley, which we see being dominant in the early medieval period, and this follows the pattern seen elsewhere in Scottish contexts. Evidence for bread and club wheat, which is used to produce white leaven bread, was present within the assemblage, and this is notable as it is generally considered a high status foodstuff and not particularly well suited to growing in Scottish climates. The relatively low quantities at Loak, however, may indicate that this site is relatively low status, with a primary focus on oats and a secondary focus on hulled barley. The absence of significant cereal chaff from either the kiln itself or the immediate surrounding area suggests that the crop processing is taking place somewhere else and the processed grain is being brought ready to be dried to the kilns. So this concentration of features is dating to the medieval period, included these 3 substantial kilns, 2 smithing hearths, and a variety of pits used for waste disposal. A series of truncated pits and linears indicate potential for poorly surviving structures relating to the settlement nearby, and every farm in the medieval period would have had its own grain drying kiln, but the scale that we see at Loak Farm could imply we're looking at something related to agricultural processing beyond the norm required for personal use. Potentially, this is a production centre near the agricultural land before being transported to a mill, particularly if the kilns were in use concurrently or have an overlap. Most kilns in Scotland from this period are a variation in the round form, and the medieval Ecofact assemblage is in keeping with comparable sites. The style and construction of these features is comparable, with 2 kilns identified at Peterhead near Loning Head, one of which was dated to the 13th to 15th centuries, and 4 kilns identified at Chapelton Angus remained undated, but also indicated evidence of repeated reuse and refurbishment like we see at Loak Farm. The substantial nature of the kiln at 4th Street Lane in North Berwick is a good parallel for the Loak structures. Its size led the excavators to propose it was industrial in scale, serving industries such as distilleries, granaries, and starch manufacturers. So it's feasible that the kilns at Loak Farm represent something to do with the ongoing use of the site as a farm, centralising grain drying for export to large urban centres such as Perth. Who owns and manages this farm remains unclear. There's potential higher status settlement nearby at House of Nairn, which may have an earlier precursor, destroyed by fire in the 18th century. The medieval phase that Loak Farm falls into is widely regarded as the invisible centuries in the Scottish countryside, later masked by post-medieval activity. During this period, the low-lying fertile land around the Tay was part of the heartlands of the medieval Scottish state. Archaeological investigation into these lowland rural sites has been relatively limited, and I think that really highlights the value of this recent work at Loak Farm. So to summarise, it fills a gap in the settlement pattern, and it is improving our understanding of rural medieval settlement in Perth and Kinross. So thank you to everyone involved in the project, particularly to Leanne May, who ran the site with the medieval kilns on it, and thanks to the organisers for having me here to speak and to Breedon for funding the work. Thank you.